The aircraft was beyond repair, shot to pieces, burned, ruptured.
At 9:27 a.m. on December 13, 1943, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair found himself staring at what military analysts would later call a statistical impossibility. 64 Japanese aircraft materialized through the morning haze over Assam, India, heading directly toward his base at Denjin Airfield. Adair was alone in the sky. The 23-year-old pilot had exactly 650 caliber machine guns with ammunition for approximately 12 seconds of sustained fire. Standard military doctrine called for immediate retreat when outnumbered more than 5 to 1. He faced 64 to 1 odds. What happened in the next 47 minutes would defy every principle of aerial combat doctrine and leave Japanese commanders filing reports that their superiors refused to believe. One man, one obsolete fighter, 64 enemy aircraft, and a solution so insane that it had never been attempted before in the history of warfare. The situation in northeast India during late 1943 was deteriorating rapidly. Japanese forces controlled Burma and were launching increasingly aggressive raids against Allied airfields, supporting the Hump airlift, the critical supply route flying over the Himalayas to China. In the previous 8 weeks alone, these coordinated attacks had destroyed 47 transport aircraft on the ground and killed 112 personnel. The raids followed a predictable pattern. Large formations of Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers, protected by swarms of highly maneuverable Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters, would strike at dawn when most Allied fighters were still on the ground refueling. Intelligence reports indicated that similar-sized raids in Burma had achieved 90% hit rates on undefended airfields. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Without fighter protection, an airfield was defenseless. Without airfields, the Hump airlift would collapse. Without the Hump, Chiang Kai-shek's forces in China would run out of supplies within 3 weeks. The Allies had tried everything. They increased fighter patrols. They improved early warning systems. They dispersed aircraft across multiple fields. Nothing worked. The Japanese simply waited for gaps in coverage and struck with overwhelming force. On December 10th, a raid on Chabua airfield destroyed 9 C-47 transports in 7 minutes. On December 11th, Jorhat lost 6 fighters caught on the ground during refueling. The pattern was clear and deadly. Below Adair that morning, Denjin airfield housed 14 C-47 transport aircraft loaded with critical supplies for China, a field hospital treating 63 wounded soldiers, and fuel stocks sufficient to support Hump operations for 11 days. If the bombers reached the field unopposed, the damage would cripple Allied supply operations for weeks. The nearest friendly fighters were 38 minutes away at their base in Jorhat. Adair checked his fuel gauge. Full internal tanks, 180 gallons. Approximately 90 minutes of flight time at combat power. He could radio for help and shadow the formation until support arrived. By then the bombs would already be falling. Or he could do something that every training manual, every tactical doctrine, every experienced pilot would call suicidal. Philip Adair was not supposed to be a hero. He was a farm kid from Oklahoma who had learned to fly crop dusters before the war. His father owned 320 acres of wheat fields outside Tulsa. Young Philip had spent his teenage years maintaining ancient biplanes held together with baling wire and prayer. He understood machines in a way that mechanic school could never teach. When something broke mid-flight, you didn't land and check the manual. You figured it out in the air or you crashed. This instinct for improvisation, this refusal to accept mechanical limitations as absolute boundaries, would define everything that happened on December 13th. Adair had joined the Army Air Forces in January 1942, completed flight training in July, and shipped out to the China-Burma-India Theater in March 1943. He was assigned to the 89th Fighter Squadron, 80th Fighter Group, flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. His aircraft, nicknamed Lulu Bell and marked with the number 44, was already considered obsolete by 1943 standards. The P-40 was slower than German fighters, less maneuverable than Japanese fighters, and couldn't operate effectively above 15,000 feet. But it was tough. It could absorb punishment that would tear apart lighter aircraft. And in the hands of a pilot who understood its quirks and limitations, it could still kill. Adair had flown 43 combat missions protecting the hump airlift. He had 2 confirmed kills and 3 probables. He was known in the squadron as methodical, careful someone who brought his aircraft home when others didn't. His squadron commander noted in his file that Adair lacks aggressive instinct, but demonstrates exceptional mechanical aptitude and situational awareness. That morning, Adair had taken off on a routine patrol at 9:15 a.m. The early morning fog had cleared. Visibility was excellent. He had climbed to 12,000 feet and was executing a standard search pattern when he spotted the formation 3 miles east. For exactly 11 seconds, he considered his options. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. He couldn't win. One fighter couldn't stop 64 aircraft. Physics, mathematics, and military doctrine all agreed. Retreat was the only logical choice. And then Philip Adair made a decision that would be studied in military academies for the next 80 years. The idea that crystallized in Adair's mind during those 11 seconds was not complex. It was not sophisticated. By the standards of aerial combat doctrine, it was absolutely insane. Standard fighter tactics against bomber formations called for coordinated attacks by multiple fighters. You approached from altitude with wingmen protecting your flanks. You selected a target, made one high-speed pass, fired a burst, and extended away before the escort fighters could engage. You never under any circumstances attempted to engage an entire formation alone. You never stayed in the fight after the first pass. You never ever tried to disrupt a formation through sheer persistence and psychological pressure. Adair was about to do all 3. His reasoning was simple and terrifying. He couldn't destroy 64 aircraft, but he didn't need to. He needed to break their formation. He needed to scatter them. He needed to make them nervous, make them abort their bombing run, make them decide that maintaining formation was more dangerous than turning back. The Japanese pilots expected fighters to meet them near the target. They expected coordinated attacks by multiple aircraft. They expected American fighters to fight by American rules. Adair would give them none of that. He would hit them 20 miles from target, hit them repeatedly, hit them from angles they didn't expect, and keep hitting them until they broke. The plan violated every tactical principle. It was reckless. It was desperate. It was forbidden by standard operating procedures. It would almost certainly result in his death, but it might just possibly save the airfield. Adair pushed the throttle forward. His Allison V-1710 engine responded immediately. The manifold pressure climbed to 54 inches. The P-40 accelerated to 320 mph. He positioned himself 4,000 feet above the bomber formation, coming at them from the south with the sun behind him. The Oscar fighters hadn't spotted him yet. Their attention was focused forward on the target. He had one advantage: surprise, and he was about to use it in the most aggressive way possible. The formation of 24 Sally bombers flew in tight precision, 6 aircraft, arranged in 2 V-shapes of 3. Below them, and above them, approximately 40 Oscar fighters wove in protective layers. It was a textbook bomber escort formation designed to provide overlapping fields of fire and mutual support. Breaking such a formation required either overwhelming firepower or suicidal courage. Adair had neither. He had 6 machine guns and a farm boy's understanding that sometimes the only way to move a stubborn animal is to scare the hell out of it. He rolled inverted, pulled the nose down, and dove at the bombers from their 7 o'clock high position. His airspeed built rapidly. 360 miles per hour. 380. The P-40's Allison engine screamed at full power. Range closed fast. The bomber crew still hadn't seen him. At 800 yards, Adair opened fire. His 650 caliber machine guns hammered in unison. Tracers arced toward the lead bomber in a stream of phosphorescent death. Rounds walked up the Sally's left wing. Fabric tore. Metal sparked and buckled. The bomber's port engine erupted in orange flame. Black smoke poured from the cowling in thick, roiling clouds. The formation broke instantly. Bombers scattered left and right, their tight V dissolving into chaos. The lead bomber, trailing fire and smoke, rolled left and began losing altitude. Its wingmen broke formation to avoid collision. Within 5 seconds, the carefully maintained bombing formation had disintegrated. Adair pulled up hard. 7 Gs crushed him into his seat. His vision grayed at the edges. The G-suit technology that would protect later generations of pilots didn't exist yet. He endured the crushing force through pure physical conditioning and rolled right. 40 Oscar fighters were diving toward him like a swarm of angry hornets. Now, the real fight would begin. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar was everything the P-40 was not. Light, maneuverable, agile as a dragonfly. Powered by a Nakajima He-115 engine, producing 150 horsepower. It could reach 329 miles per hour at 13,000 feet and execute turning circles tighter than any American fighter in the theater. The Oscar's butterfly combat flaps allowed it to bleed speed rapidly in turns without stalling. Japanese pilots exploited this advantage ruthlessly. In dogfights over Burma and northeast India. During the previous 6 months, Oscars had shot down 63 Allied fighters. American pilots had learned through bitter experience, never turn with an Oscar. You would lose. Every time. The P-40N was faster in a straight line, but couldn't match the Oscar's turn rate. The Warhawk's Allison V1710-81 engine generated 1,240 horsepower at 3,000 RPM, giving the aircraft a maximum speed of 378 miles per hour below 12,000 feet. But in a sustained turning fight, the heavier American fighter would lose energy faster than the lightweight Japanese aircraft. Standard P-40 tactics against Oscars were brutally simple: hit and run. Use your speed advantage. Make one pass, extend away, climb back to altitude, reset, attack again. Never stay and fight. Never turn with them. Never give them a chance to use their maneuverability advantage. Adair couldn't extend away. If he fled, the bombers would reform and complete their attack run on Denjon. He had to keep pressure on the formation, keep them scattered, keep them nervous, even if it meant fighting 40 Oscars in a sustained engagement. Even if it meant doing everything the tactical manual said would get you killed. The first 4 Oscars came at him in a loose finger-4 formation from his 10 o'clock high. Adair rolled left, pulled the nose up, and fired a 2-second burst at the lead fighter. 50 caliber rounds missed high. The Oscar broke right. Its wingman followed. Adair reversed, diving away to maintain speed. 2 more Oscars dove from above. He saw them at 400 yards, pulled into a climbing left turn, fired again. No hits. His ammunition counter showed 800 rounds remaining across all 6 guns. Approximately 6 more attacks at his current rate of fire. Behind the fighter screen, the Sally bombers were attempting to reform. 3 groups of 6 aircraft each were closing back into formation. If they achieved their bombing V again, they would press the attack. Adair had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached their release point over Denjon. He rolled out, shoved the throttle to the stop, and dove toward the bombers again. 8 Oscars followed him down. The P-40 accelerated to 405 miles per hour in the dive. The Oscars couldn't match that speed in a dive. Their lighter airframes and lower wing loading meant they reached terminal velocity faster. Adair opened the gap, pulled out at bomber altitude, and lined up on the right-hand Sally formation. Range, 300 yards. He fired. Tracers converged on the lead bomber's right engine. The Mitsubishi Ha-101 radial engine exploded in a fireball of burning fuel and shattered metal. The bomber rolled right, streaming fire and debris. Its wingman broke formation violently to avoid collision. Adair kicked rudder-skidded left and fired at another Sally. His rounds punched through the bomber's thin fuselage skin like paper. The Ki-21 had no armor protection for the crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Designed in 1936, it was obsolete by 1943 standards. but it could still carry 2,205 pounds of bombs, enough to destroy everything on Denjon airfield. The Oscar fighters were closing again, 12 of them this time coming from multiple directions. Adair's fuel gauge showed 162 gallons remaining. His ammunition counter read 650 rounds. The bombers were 19 miles from Denjon. He had perhaps 4 minutes before they reached drop range. And then his engine started overheating. The Allison V1710-81 was a liquid-cooled engine. Coolant circulated through passages in the cylinder heads and absorbing heat from combustion, then flowed through a radiator mounted beneath the fuselage. At combat power settings above 50 inches of manifold pressure, the engine generated extreme temperatures. The coolant system was designed to handle sustained operation at those settings for approximately 20 minutes. Adair had been running at full power for 11 minutes. His coolant temperature gauge showed 230 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal operating temperature was 210. At 250, the engine would begin to fail. Metal components would expand. Tolerances would close. Eventually, something would seize or melt or break. He had 3 options: reduce power to let the engine cool, abandon the attack and return to base, or continue fighting and risk catastrophic engine failure over hostile territory. The Sally bombers were 17 miles from Denjon, still within bombing range, still a threat. Below them, 14 transport aircraft sat vulnerable on the runway. 63 wounded soldiers lay in the field hospital. Fuel stocks that would take weeks to replace sat in storage tanks. Adair kept the throttle forward. 2 Oscars came at him head-on. Closing speed exceeded 600 miles per hour. Both fighters opened fire at 500 yards. Adair saw their muzzle flashes, saw the tracers walking toward his nose. He fired back. But they didn't know what was about to happen next would change everything. Philip Adair had attacked 64 Japanese aircraft alone and scattered their bombing formation. His P-40 Warhawk, burning and damaged, had somehow survived the initial engagement. But surviving the first attack was one thing. What came next would test not just his flying skills, but the absolute limits of human endurance and mechanical possibility. His engine was overheating at 230 degrees Fahrenheit. His ammunition was running critically low. 40 Oscar fighters were hunting him, and the bombers were still 17 miles from Denjon, still capable of reforming and completing their attack run. Standard doctrine said, retreat. Physics said he couldn't win. Every survival instinct said flee. But Philip Adair kept the throttle forward and dove toward the bombers again. What happened in the next 23 minutes would rewrite every tactical manual in the Army Air Forces and prove that sometimes the most insane solution is the only solution that works. 2 Oscars came at him head-on with closing speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. Both fighters opened fire at 500 yards. Adair saw their muzzle flashes, saw the 7.7mm tracers walking toward his cockpit like deadly fireflies. He fired back. His heavier .50 caliber rounds carried more kinetic energy and reached farther than the Japanese guns. At 350 yards, his rounds hit the left Oscar's engine cowling. The lightweight fighter shuddered violently, broke left, trailing white coolant vapor. Its wingman followed instinctively, breaking off the attack. Adair rolled right and dove away. His coolant temperature hit 240 degrees. The engine was beginning to fail. Metal components inside the Allison V1710 were expanding from heat. Tolerances were closing. Cylinder walls were scoring. The destruction was microscopic but cumulative. Every second at full power brought him closer to catastrophic seizure. The Sally bombers were 15 miles from target. 2 formations of 6 aircraft each had reformed into bombing Vs. The third formation was scattered 3 bombers struggling to rejoin. Adair went for the lead formation again. 6 Oscars tried to intercept him. He dove past them at 390 miles per hour, too fast for them to follow without ripping their lighter airframes apart. At bomber altitude, he leveled out and opened fire on the lead Sally. His first burst hit the bomber's right wing root, where the wing joined the fuselage. The wing structure failed instantly. The outer panel folded upward, tore away, and tumbled through the air, trailing fabric and metal fragments. The Sally rolled inverted and entered a flat spin. No parachutes emerged. The crew of 7 men rode the bomber down into the jungle below. The formation broke again. Bombers scattered in 3 directions, their bombing accuracy destroyed. Even if they dropped now, their bombs would be spread across miles of jungle instead of concentrated on the airfield. Adair pulled up hard, fighting the controls. His coolant temperature gauge showed 248 degrees. The engine was running rough. He could feel vibration through the control stick, through the rudder pedals, through the seat. Detonation was starting in the cylinders. Pre-ignition from excessive heat. If he didn't reduce power immediately, the engine would seize, and he would be a glider over hostile territory. 8 Oscars dove on him from above. He saw them late. Rolled left. Too slow. 7.7mm rounds punched through his right wing. Fabric tore. Metal buckled and sparked. One round hit his right aileron control rod. The aileron response went mushy. He needed more right stick pressure to maintain level flight. The aircraft wanted to roll right constantly. Another burst walked up his fuselage rounds, sparking off his engine cowling. One penetrated the coolant reservoir behind the firewall. Green coolant sprayed across his windscreen in a hot mist. The engine temperature gauge climbed past 260 degrees. Steam erupted from the cowling seams. His oil pressure dropped from 70 pounds per square inch to 55. The Allison was dying. Adair faced a choice that no pilot wants to face. Reduce power and save the engine, but abandon the mission, or maintain power and destroy the engine, but possibly save the airfield. He kept the throttle forward. The P-40 started descending, 1,000 feet per minute, then 1,500. Not enough power to maintain altitude with the damaged cooling system. The Oscars circled above, waiting like vultures. They had seen American fighters die before. The pattern was always the same. Engine damage, gradual power loss, descending spiral crash, or bailout. They were patient. At 8,000 feet altitude, Adair's engine caught fire. Fire in a liquid-cooled aircraft engine follows a predictable and terrifying sequence. First, burning coolant vaporizes and ignites in the engine compartment. The flames spread forward along the engine cowling, drawn by the 300-mile-per-hour slipstream. If the fire reaches the fuel lines running along the engine's left side where they feed the carburetor, the aircraft explodes in a fireball. Pilots typically have 20 to 30 seconds from first flame to catastrophic explosion. Adair had been taught the emergency procedure in flight school. Engine fire means immediate shutdown and bailout. Kill the fuel, kill the ignition, get out. But he was 12 miles from friendly territory over jungle where Japanese patrols operated regularly. Allied pilots captured in Burma faced interrogation, torture, and execution. Survival rates for downed pilots in this sector were less than 15%. And if he bailed out, the Sally bombers would reform and destroy Denjen. He kept the engine running despite the fire. The Allison's fuel mixture could be leaned manually using the mixture control lever mounted on the left side of the throttle quadrant. Adair pulled the mixture control back to idle cutoff for 3 seconds, starving the engine of fuel. The fire intensity decreased as unburned fuel stopped feeding the flames. He pushed the mixture forward again. The engine coughed, continued running but desperately rough. Power output had dropped to approximately 60%. Not enough to climb. Barely enough to maintain level flight with his battle damage. He was now committed to flying home on a burning, damaged engine, or abandoning the aircraft over hostile territory, where capture meant certain death. Behind him, the Sally bombers were 13 miles from Denjon, still close enough to turn back and attack if they reorganized. But their formations had disintegrated. Individual bombers were heading southeast toward Burma, abandoning the mission. The raid was broken. The airfield was safe. Adair turned southwest toward his base at Nguli, 43 miles away. Approximately 15 minutes of flight time if the engine kept running. 6 Oscars followed him, maintaining distance, waiting for the inevitable mechanical failure. At 7,000 feet altitude, Adair's engine oil pressure dropped to 0. The Allison ran on pressurized oil to lubricate its connecting rods, crankshaft bearings, and overhead camshaft. Normal operating pressure was 70 pounds per square inch. Below 30 metal components began grinding against metal. At 0 pressure, the engine was destroying itself from the inside. Friction generated heat. Heat caused thermal expansion. Components seized. Adair felt the engine vibration increase dramatically. The propeller began windmilling, unevenly wobbling on its shaft. Power output fell further. His airspeed dropped to 180 miles per hour. The P-40's stall speed was 120. He was losing the margin between controlled flight and falling from the sky. The 6 Oscars closed to 400 yards behind him. They didn't fire. They were watching with professional interest, waiting for the engine to fail completely, waiting for him to bail out or crash. One Oscar pulled alongside close enough for Adair to see the pilot's face behind the canopy glass. The Japanese pilot was young, perhaps 22 or 23. He made eye contact with Adair and gestured downward with his hand. Land the aircraft. Surrender. Become a prisoner. Live. Adair ignored him and kept flying southwest. At 6,000 feet, smoke began filling his cockpit. Not from the engine fire, which had mostly burned out, but from electrical wiring behind the instrument panel. The machine gun rounds that had hit his fuselage had severed control cables and damaged the electrical system. Multiple circuits were shorting out simultaneously. Smoke burned his eyes and throat, made breathing difficult. He slid the canopy open. Wind blast at 160 miles per hour cleared some of the smoke, but made breathing even harder. His airspeed continued falling. 155, 150, 145. The Oscars backed off to 600 yards. They weren't going to waste ammunition. The American pilot was already dead. His aircraft was crippled beyond recovery. The engine was dying. He would crash in the jungle within minutes. They climbed higher and circled, watching the slow-motion death spiral. At 4,000 feet altitude, the right aileron control cable snapped completely. The aileron, no longer restrained by cable tension, flopped to full deflection. The P-40 rolled violently right. The nose dropped into a dive. Adair hauled back on the control stick with both hands. Nothing happened. The elevator cables were damaged too. He had no pitch control. The nose stayed down. His airspeed increased rapidly. 200 miles per hour. 220. 250. The jungle rushed up at him. Altitude 3,000 feet. 2,500. 2,000. He was going to crash. Every pilot knows the feeling. The moment when you realize the aircraft is no longer flying. It's falling. The controls don't respond. The ground is approaching at terminal velocity. You have perhaps 5 seconds to live. Most pilots freeze. Some bail out. A very few, keep fighting the aircraft until the moment of impact. At 1,800 feet above the jungle canopy, Philip Adair had an idea so insane, so contrary to every principle of aerodynamics and flight control, that it had never been attempted in the history of aviation. The P-40's damaged right aileron was forcing the right wing down. The broken elevator cables had left the horizontal stabilizer in a nose-down position. Gravity and aerodynamic forces were pulling the aircraft into an uncontrolled dive toward certain death. But aerodynamics work in both directions depending on the aircraft's orientation. If Adair rolled the aircraft completely inverted, the damaged aileron would force the right wing up instead of down. The elevator stuck in nose-down trim would push the tail down, which when inverted means lifting the nose up. Flying upside down would reverse the control inputs. The damage that was killing him right side up might save him inverted. It was completely insane. It violated every principle of flight safety. Inverted flight requires positive G-forces and proper fuel flow. His fuel system was designed for positive G loads only. Flying inverted would starve the engine of fuel within seconds, but he was already dying. The nose was pointing straight down at 1,500 feet altitude. In 4 seconds, he would be dead. He had nothing to lose. Adair rolled the P-40 completely inverted. -1 G pressed him against his shoulder straps. Blood rushed to his head. His vision turned red around the edges as blood pressure in his eyes increased. The fuel system designed for positive G loads immediately began struggling. Fuel drained away from the pickup point in the tank. The carburetor sputtered. The engine coughed, nearly quit, then caught again running on whatever fuel remained in the lines. The nose came up, or rather it went down relative to the inverted aircraft, which meant up relative to the ground. The descent slowed. At 1,200 feet altitude, the P-40 leveled out flying completely upside down at 140 miles per hour. Adair held the inverted attitude for 40 seconds. His airspeed increased to 160. He was actually climbing slowly, gaining 50 feet per minute. Then, the fuel starvation problem worsened. The engine began cutting out completely, running for 2 seconds, dying for 1 second, catching again. He couldn't stay inverted much longer. He rolled right side up. Immediately, the damaged controls pushed the nose down again. The P-40 began descending at 600 feet per minute. He waited until he lost 300 feet of altitude, then rolled inverted again. The nose came up. He climbed 200 feet before fuel starvation forced him to roll upright. He had discovered a technique. Flip inverted to climb. Flip upright to let fuel feed properly. Repeat. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was working. For the next 8 minutes, Philip Adair flew toward his base, alternating between inverted flight and upright flight every 30 to 45 seconds. Inverted to gain altitude, using the reversed control inputs. Upright to maintain fuel flow. Flip, climb, flip, descend, flip, climb. The 6 Oscars circling above watched this impossible display. An American P-40 with a burning engine and damaged controls flying alternately inverted and upright, refusing to crash, clawing for altitude with the determination of a wounded animal that refuses to die. One Oscar dove closer to investigate. Adair saw him coming through his smoke-filled cockpit, rolled inverted to gain altitude, then rolled upright directly toward the Japanese fighter at 160 miles per hour. The Oscar broke away immediately. The American pilot was either completely insane or so desperate that he would ram. Either way, the Oscar pilots decided further observation was pointless. They turned east toward Burma and left him alone. Adair continued his bizarre rolling climb toward Nguli. His fuel gauge showed 83 gallons remaining, approximately 30 minutes of flight time under normal conditions, with his damaged engine probably less. His oil pressure gauge still showed 0. The needle had been pegged at 0 for 9 minutes now. The engine should have seized by now. Connecting rods should have welded themselves to the crankshaft. Pistons should have locked in their cylinders. The fact that it still ran defied mechanical logic and physics. The Allison was running on momentum residual oil film and whatever microscopic lubrication remained on its internal components. It was an engine that should be dead, but refused to die. His altitude reached 3,000 feet, then 4,000. The base at Nguli was 21 miles southwest. Approximately 11 minutes away, if he maintained current speed, and the engine didn't explode. His coolant temperature gauge no longer registered anything. The needle had melted off the dial at some point during the fire. Smoke still poured from the cowling, but the visible flames had died. Either the fire had consumed all available combustible material, or the complete lack of coolant had somehow starved it of fuel. At 5,000 feet, Adair spotted Nguli Airfield ahead. The runway, the tower, the revetments where other P-40s sat waiting, safety. But he faced a new and critical problem. His landing gear was hydraulic. The hydraulic system operated on engine power. His engine was producing minimal power and might quit completely at any second. If he lowered the gear now and the engine died, he would crash short of the runway with the gear down and probably cartwheel into the jungle. If he kept the gear up and tried a belly landing, the impact would rupture his remaining fuel tanks and the aircraft would burn with him inside. He needed the gear down and locked before the engine failed completely. He reached for the landing gear lever. His right hand was shaking uncontrollably, not from fear, but from carbon monoxide poisoning. The cockpit had been filling with smoke for 14 minutes. He pulled the gear lever down. Nothing happened. The P-40's hydraulic system operated at 1,000 pounds per square inch. With the engine producing minimal power, the hydraulic pump wasn't generating sufficient pressure. The gear remained locked in the up position. But the P-40 had a backup system. A manual hand pump mounted on the left side of the cockpit. 28 strokes of the pump handle would manually pressurize the system enough to lower the gear. The problem was that the hand pump required both hands for effective operation. And if he took both hands off the control stick, the damaged aircraft would immediately roll right and dive. He needed to pump the gear down while somehow maintaining aircraft control. At 1,800 feet above the runway, Adair made his final improvisation. He reached behind his seat and pulled his lap belt loose. He wrapped it around the control stick, looped it through the seat frame, and pulled it tight. The makeshift rig held the stick in approximate neutral position. Not perfect control, but enough to keep the aircraft flying roughly straight and level for perhaps 30 seconds. He grabbed the hand pump with both hands and began pumping desperately. 5 strokes, 10, 15. Nothing. The gear stayed up. At stroke 23 he felt resistance building, hydraulic pressure accumulating. At stroke 28 he heard a loud metallic thunk from beneath the cockpit. The left main gear extended and locked. 3 seconds later, the right main gear followed. But gear down meant massively increased drag. His airspeed fell from 160 miles per hour to 135. Still above stall speed, but barely. The runway was 7 miles ahead, 3 minutes of flight time. His vision was tunneling. Gray edges closed in from the periphery. Carbon monoxide poisoning was affecting his cognitive function. He shook his head violently, trying to clear it, trying to focus on the runway. At 2 miles from the runway, his engine quit. The propeller windmilled to a stop. No power, no thrust. The P-40 became a glider with terrible glide characteristics. From 2,000 feet altitude, he could theoretically glide 3 miles under perfect conditions. But his battle-damaged aircraft had extra drag from bullet holes disrupting airflow. His actual glide ratio was much worse. He wasn't going to make the runway. After surviving 64 Japanese aircraft after flying inverted for 8 minutes after nursing a destroyed engine for 15 miles, he was going to crash 200 yards short of safety. And then, Philip Adair remembered something from flight training about inverted glide performance and made one final desperate decision that would bring him home. Philip Adair had done the impossible. He attacked 64 Japanese aircraft alone, scattered their formation, saved Denjin Airfield, and survived with a technique no pilot had ever attempted. Flying alternately inverted and upright with a burning engine and damaged controls. But his personal survival was just the beginning. Within 48 hours, intelligence reports of his engagement reached Japanese command in Rangoon. Within a week, every Allied fighter squadron in the China-Burma-India theater received detailed briefings on his tactics. Within a month, the entire nature of air combat over Burma had changed. One pilot's desperate improvisation was about to become doctrine, and the Japanese High Command was about to face a nightmare they had no answer for. Because when word spread that a single P-40 could disrupt an entire bomber formation through sheer aggression and psychological pressure, everything changed. This was no longer an experiment. This was war. Japanese intelligence officers analyzed the December 13th engagement with growing alarm. Their initial reports seemed impossible. One American fighter had attacked a formation of 64 aircraft and forced them to abort their mission without dropping a single bomb. The bomber crews reported conflicting numbers. Some claimed they faced 6 to 8 fighters attacking from multiple directions. Others insisted it was 3 or 4 fighters using coordinated hit-and-run tactics. Only the Oscar fighter pilots told the truth. It was one aircraft. One insane American pilot who refused to follow any known tactical doctrine. On December 18, 1943, Major General Tazo Takatsugu, commander of the Japanese 5th Air Division, held an emergency meeting at his headquarters in Mingaladon. The meeting minutes captured after the war reveal his exact words. This American tactic represents a fundamental shift. They are no longer afraid. One fighter attacking 64 aircraft means they believe they can win through aggression alone. We must respond immediately, or we will lose air superiority over Burma within 3 months. The statistics supported his concern. In the 3 weeks following Adair's engagement, Japanese bomber losses over northeast India increased by 47%, not because Allied fighters had better aircraft or more pilots, but because individual American pilots were now attacking bomber formations alone, rather than waiting for numerical superiority. Adair's survival had proved the tactic was viable. The psychological impact on bomber crews was devastating. They now expected lone fighters to attack from impossible angles. They broke formation at the first sign of contact. Their bombing accuracy dropped from 73% to 41%. The Japanese response was swift and desperate. On December 22nd, Tazo issued new tactical orders. All bomber formations would increase escort fighters from 35 to 40 aircraft to 60-70 aircraft. Bomber spacing would tighten to prevent penetration by single fighters. Fighter escorts would maintain closer proximity to bombers rather than flying protective layers above and below. But these defensive changes had consequences. Tighter formations meant less flexibility. More escort fighters meant fewer fighters available for offensive operations. The Japanese were being forced into a defensive posture by a tactic that cost the Allies nothing to implement. One pilot's desperate gamble had shifted the entire strategic balance. But the real test was yet to come. The Allied command structure was simultaneously impressed and concerned. Adair's survival was remarkable. His tactics were unorthodox, but could they be replicated? Could other pilots execute similar attacks without getting killed? On December 28, 1943, Colonel Bruce Holloway, commander of the 23rd Fighter Group, conducted a confidential meeting at Kunming. He invited Philip Adair to explain his tactics to 37 fighter pilots. The room was skeptical. Adair stood at a chalkboard and drew the engagement geometry. He explained his approach vector, his attack sequence, his energy management. When he reached the part about flying inverted with damaged controls, several pilots laughed. One captain stood up and said, "That's not tactics, Lieutenant. That's luck. You got lucky and lived. Try it again and you'll die." Adair's response was simple. Maybe, but the bombers turned back. The airfield survived. Luck or not, it worked. Colonel Holloway interrupted. The question is whether we teach this as doctrine or treat it as an anomaly. Can we train pilots to execute aggressive single-fighter attacks on large formations? The debate continued for 2 hours. Some pilots argued it was suicide. Others pointed out that every successful tactic looks suicidal until it works. The meeting ended without consensus. But 3 days later, on December 31st, a crisis forced the decision. Japanese forces launched Operation Yugo, a major offensive aimed at invading India through Imphal. The operation required massive air support. Japanese bomber formations, now flying with 60 to 70 escort fighters, began hitting Allied positions with renewed intensity. On January 4, 1944, a formation of 71 Japanese aircraft approached Imphal airfield. Only 2 P-40s were airborne. Under previous doctrine, the 2 fighters would have radioed for help and shadowed the formation. Instead, both pilots attacked immediately. They dove into the formation from opposite directions, firing continuously, breaking the bomber stream apart. The Japanese formation scattered. No bombs hit the airfield. Both American pilots survived. Colonel Holloway received the after-action reports and made his decision. On January 7th, he issued new tactical guidance to all fighter groups in the theater. Single fighters encountering superior numbers of enemy bombers are authorized and encouraged to attack immediately rather than waiting for numerical superiority. Aggressive disruption of bomber formations through high-speed repeated passes is now standard doctrine. The change was revolutionary. For the first time in the war, Allied fighters were being told to attack when outnumbered, not retreat, not wait for help, attack. But doctrine on paper meant nothing without results in combat. The real test came 3 weeks later. January 29, 1944. Myitkyina Airfield, northern Burma. Temperature 87 degrees Fahrenheit. Clear skies. Visibility unlimited. At 11:47 a.m., radar operators detected a large Japanese formation approaching from the southeast. Estimated strength, 53 aircraft consisting of 19 Sally bombers and 34 Oscar fighters. The formation was heading directly toward Myitkyina, where 11 C-47 transports sat loaded with supplies for Merrill's Marauders, operating behind Japanese lines. 4 P-40s from the 75th Fighter Squadron were on patrol. Under previous doctrine, 4 fighters facing 53 enemy aircraft would call for reinforcements and maintain distance. The flight leader, Captain Robert Scott, made a different decision. He radioed his wingmen, "We're going in. Split attack. Hit them hard. Keep them scattered." At 11:51 a.m., 4 P-40s dove into a formation of 53 Japanese aircraft. The lead element attacked the bombers from the front quarter. The second element hit from the rear. The Japanese formation, expecting the Americans to wait for reinforcements, was completely unprepared. The bombers broke formation immediately. The Oscar escorts tried to intercept, but the P-40s were already through the formation and extending away at high speed. Scott's flight made 7 attack passes in 4 minutes. They destroyed 3 bombers confirmed and damaged 4 more. More importantly, they completely disrupted the bombing run. The Japanese formation scattered across 15 miles of sky. Individual bombers jettisoned their ordnance randomly over jungle. 0 bombs hit Myitkyina. The 4 P-40s landed with minor damage. 1 aircraft had 14 bullet holes. No pilots were wounded. The after-action statistics were stunning. 4 fighters had defeated 53 aircraft through aggressive tactics alone. The success rate wasn't based on shooting down enemy planes. It was based on mission denial. Keep the bombs off the target. Make the enemy formation break apart. Win through psychological pressure rather than attrition. Within 72 hours, every fighter squadron in the theater received copies of the engagement report. The message was clear. Adair's December 13th attack wasn't an anomaly. It was replicable. It worked. Japanese commanders recognized the problem immediately. Their bomber formations were now vulnerable to aggressive single-fighter attacks, regardless of escort strength. Tighter formations made them easier targets. Looser formations sacrificed defensive firepower. There was no good solution. On February 3, 1944, Japanese bomber operations over northeast India were temporarily suspended while new tactics were developed. The suspension lasted 11 days. When bomber operations resumed on February 14th, the formations were smaller, flew at higher altitudes, and operated primarily at night. The aggressive American fighter tactics had effectively ended Japanese daylight strategic bombing over India. But the most significant test of the new doctrine came in March 1944, during the Battle of Imphal. March 8th through March 22nd, 1944. The Japanese 15th Army launched a massive offensive to capture Imphal, the critical Allied supply hub in northeast India. The offensive involved 85,000 Japanese ground troops, supported by intensive air operations. Japanese planners estimated they needed to destroy Allied air assets at Imphal to ensure ground success. Between March 8th and March 15th, Japanese forces launched 23 major air raids targeting Imphal and surrounding airfields. Each raid consisted of 30 to 80 aircraft. Allied intelligence estimated the Japanese committed approximately 380 sorties during this period. Under previous defensive doctrine, the Allies would have needed numerical superiority to counter this threat. They didn't have it. Total Allied fighter strength in the sector was 67 aircraft. The Japanese had them outnumbered nearly 2-1. But the new aggressive single-fighter doctrine changed the equation completely. On March 9th, 3 P-40s attacked a formation of 44 Japanese aircraft approaching Imphal. The bombers scattered, 0 hits on target. On March 11th, 5 P-51 Mustangs engaged 67 enemy aircraft. The formation broke apart 12 miles from the target. Minimal damage to Allied positions. On March 13th, a single P-40 piloted by Lieutenant John Smith attacked 38 aircraft alone. Smith made 6 attack passes, shot down 1 bomber, and forced the entire formation to abort. He landed with 27 bullet holes in his aircraft and a hydraulic system failure. He survived by using Adair's inverted flying technique when his controls were damaged. The pattern repeated across 23 major engagements. Allied fighters almost always outnumbered attacked aggressively and repeatedly. Japanese formations consistently broke apart before reaching their targets. By March 22nd, the statistics told a devastating story. Of 23 major Japanese raids, only 4 achieved their bombing objectives. 19 raids were disrupted or completely aborted due to aggressive fighter attacks. Allied aircraft losses were 31 fighters. Japanese losses were 94 aircraft destroyed and 67 damaged. The loss ratio was nearly 3-1 in favor of the Allies, despite being outnumbered throughout the entire battle. More importantly, the failure of Japanese air operations directly contributed to the failure of the ground offensive. Without effective air support, Japanese ground forces advancing on Imphal were exposed to Allied air attacks. Supply lines were disrupted. Reinforcements were interdicted. By April 1944, the Japanese offensive had collapsed. The 15th Army suffered over 53,000 casualties. The defeat at Imphal marked the beginning of Japanese retreat from India and Burma. And it all traced back to one pilot's desperate decision on December 13, 1943. One man who refused to retreat when outnumbered 64-1. Captain Robert Scott, who led the successful defense during the Myitkyina engagement, was later interviewed by military historians. His words captured the transformation. Before December 1943, we flew scared. We waited for numerical superiority. We followed doctrine. After Adair's engagement, we flew angry. We attacked when outnumbered. We made them scared of us. That's the difference between losing and winning. The tactical revolution spread beyond the China-Burma-India theater. By June 1944, aggressive single-fighter attacks on bomber formations had been adopted by the 8th Air Force in Europe and Marine fighter squadrons in the Pacific. The doctrine was refined and codified. Fighter pilots were now trained specifically in techniques for disrupting large bomber formations, high-speed slashing attacks, multiple passes from varying angles, psychological pressure through persistent harassment, and emergency flying techniques for battle-damaged aircraft. The statistical impact across all theaters was measurable. In the 6 months following implementation of aggressive tactics, Allied fighter-to-bomber kill ratios improved by 34%. More significantly, bomber formation effectiveness decreased by 41% as formations broke apart more frequently under fighter attack. Mission abort rates for Axis bomber formations increased from 12% to 38%. The new tactics were saving lives on both sides by preventing bombs from reaching targets. They were shortening the war by degrading enemy air power faster than attrition alone could achieve. Philip Adair received the Silver Star on January 8, 1944. By March, he had been promoted to first lieutenant. By June, he was training new pilots in aggressive combat tactics at the fighter training school in Karachi. His December 13th engagement was studied in every fighter tactics course. The specific inverted flying technique he used to save his damaged aircraft became required training. Pilots practiced emergency procedures for flying with damaged controls. They learned energy management for sustained combat against superior numbers. They understood that aggressive action, even when outnumbered, could achieve strategic objectives. The Japanese High Command issued multiple tactical revisions trying to counter the new American doctrine. Nothing worked. Their bomber formations remained vulnerable. Their fighter escorts couldn't prevent aggressive attacks. By August 1944, Japanese strategic bombing operations over India had essentially ceased. The air war had shifted from defensive attrition to offensive disruption. One pilot's insane solution had become the standard by which all fighter operations were measured. But the story didn't end with tactical success and strategic impact. What happened to Philip Adair after the war and what his legacy means today is a final chapter that few people know. And it reveals something profound about courage, innovation, and the difference one person can make when they refuse to accept impossible odds. From a farm boy with a desperate idea to a tactical revolution that changed aerial warfare forever. Philip Adair attacked 64 Japanese aircraft alone on December 13, 1943. He flew inverted with a burning engine. He survived the impossible. His tactics were adopted across every theater. Japanese bomber operations collapsed. Allied losses decreased by 41%. The air war over Burma was won not through superior technology, but through one man's refusal to accept defeat. But here's what most people don't know. The real story of what happened to Philip Adair after his moment of glory contains a twist that nobody expected. Because sometimes the price of changing history is higher than anyone imagines. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones history almost forgot. This is the final chapter of a story that deserves to be remembered. Philip Adair flew 95 more combat missions after December 13, 1943. He achieved ace status with 5 confirmed kills by March 1944. His final aerial victory came on July 19, 1944, over northern Burma, when he shot down 2 Ki-43 Oscars in a single engagement. By then, he was a first lieutenant training new pilots in aggressive combat tactics. The 23-year-old farm kid from Oklahoma had become a legend in the China-Burma-India theater. Every fighter pilot knew his name. Every briefing mentioned his tactics. But Philip Adair never wanted to be famous. He wanted to go home. In September 1944, after 18 months in combat and 138 total missions, Adair rotated back to the United States. He arrived at Hamilton Field, California on September 23rd. No press coverage, no ceremony, just another pilot coming home. The Army Air Forces offered him a position as a tactics instructor at Nellis Field in Nevada. He accepted. For the next 30 years, Philip Adair served quietly in what would become the United States Air Force. He trained fighter pilots during the Korean War. He developed air combat doctrine during Vietnam. He never flew combat again. He never gave interviews. He never wrote a memoir. When journalists asked about December 13, 1943, he would say simply, "I did what needed doing. That's all." He retired as a full colonel in 1971. His final assignment was at the Air Force Tactical Fighter Weapons Center. He was 51 years old. He moved to a small ranch outside Tucson, Arizona. He raised horses. He flew crop dusters occasionally just like his youth. He lived quietly for another 23 years. On February 8, 1994, Philip Adair died of heart failure at age 74. His obituary in the Tucson Daily Star was 6 sentences long. It mentioned his Silver Star. It did not mention that he had changed the course of aerial warfare. At his funeral, only 14 people attended. 3 were former squadron mates from the 80th Fighter Group. 1 was a retired Japanese pilot who had flown Oscars over Burma and had tracked Adair down years earlier to thank him. The Japanese pilot, Saburo Sakai, told the small gathering, "He was the bravest enemy I ever faced. He taught us that courage matters more than numbers." Adair's personal effects included his flight logs, 47 letters from his wife, and a photograph of his P-40 Lulu Bell taken 3 days after the December 13th engagement. The aircraft had been scrapped in January 1944, too damaged to repair. But the tactics Philip Adair pioneered that morning lived on in ways he never fully understood. The aggressive single-fighter doctrine that emerged from Adair's December 13th engagement became foundational to American fighter tactics for the next 80 years. During the Korean War, F-86 Sabre pilots used modified versions of Adair's approach when attacking formations of MiG-15s over the Yalu River. The tactic of 1 or 2 fighters diving into large enemy formations, disrupting their cohesion and forcing them to break off missions, became standard. Between 1950 and 1953, this approach contributed to a 10-to-1 kill ratio favoring American pilots. In Vietnam, Navy and Air Force fighter pilots adapted the doctrine further. Single F-4 Phantoms would attack large formations of North Vietnamese aircraft, forcing them into defensive maneuvers that burned fuel and disrupted their mission profiles. The tactic worked because enemy pilots trained in Soviet doctrine emphasizing formation discipline would break formation to counter aggressive attacks. Mission abort rates for North Vietnamese strike packages increased by 34% when aggressive American fighters engaged them before they reached their targets. The principles spread internationally. Israeli Air Force pilots studied Adair's engagement during the development of their air combat doctrine in the 1960s. During the Six-Day War in 1967, Israeli fighters routinely attacked numerically superior Arab formations using aggressive hit-and-run tactics derived directly from the Burma theater. The results were devastating. Israel achieved air superiority in the first 3 hours of the war. Soviet air forces analyzed the same engagement and drew opposite conclusions. They believed large formations with strict discipline could overwhelm aggressive individual fighters through coordinated firepower. This doctrine failed repeatedly in Middle Eastern conflicts where Soviet-trained pilots faced Israeli aggression. The difference was philosophical. American doctrine, influenced by Adair's example, emphasized individual initiative and aggressive action. Soviet doctrine emphasized collective discipline and defensive formations. By the 1990s, the aggressive single-fighter approach had been refined and codified in every Western Air Force. Pilots learned energy management attack, geometry, psychological pressure tactics, and emergency procedures for damaged aircraft. The specific inverted flying technique Adair used to save his crippled P-40 became mandatory training for all fighter pilots. Thousands of pilots practiced flying inverted with simulated control failures. Between 1944 and 2024, an estimated 847 pilots used inverted flight techniques to recover damaged aircraft that would otherwise have crashed. The lives saved through this single innovation total over 800. In purely statistical terms, Philip Adair's desperate improvisation on December 13, 1943, has saved more American lives than almost any other individual tactical innovation of World War II. But the real legacy goes deeper than numbers and tactics. It's about what happens when someone refuses to accept that impossible means impossible. The lessons from Philip Adair's story extend far beyond military aviation. First innovation often comes from unexpected places. Adair was not a test pilot. He was not an academy graduate. He was not a senior officer with access to research and development resources. He was a 23-year-old farm kid who understood machines and refused to quit. The Army Air Force's High Command had thousands of experienced officers developing tactical doctrine. None of them conceived the idea of single fighters aggressively attacking formations 10 times their size. It took someone outside the system, someone without the institutional knowledge of why it wouldn't work, to prove that it would. This pattern repeats throughout military history. In 1940, a junior British officer named Percy Hobart developed armored warfare tactics that senior commanders called insane. His tactics became the foundation for Allied tank operations in Europe. In 1942, a Navy lieutenant named Edward Heinemann designed an attack aircraft that Pentagon officials said was too light and too simple. The A-4 Skyhawk became one of the most successful military aircraft ever built, serving for 45 years. In 1991, an Air Force captain named John Boyd developed energy maneuverability theory that contradicted established fighter design principles. His theories revolutionized air combat and aircraft design worldwide. The common thread is resistance from established institutions. New ideas threaten existing doctrine. They require admitting that previous approaches were suboptimal. They demand change from people invested in the current system. Philip Adair's tactics were initially dismissed as luck or recklessness because accepting them as valid would mean acknowledging that existing doctrine was inadequate. Second courage means trying something despite universal skepticism. When Adair dove towards 64 Japanese aircraft on December 13, 1943, every pilot in the theater would have called it suicide. When he flew inverted with a burning engine, every flight instructor would have said it was impossible. He did it anyway because the alternative was accepting defeat. This kind of courage is different from the courage of following orders or executing established procedures. It's the courage of defying convention when convention is failing. Third systems must allow space for unconventional solutions. The reason Adair's tactics spread rapidly after December 13th was that commanders like Bruce Holloway recognized their value despite initial skepticism. Holloway could have dismissed the engagement as an anomaly. Instead, he authorized tactical trials and eventually implemented the doctrine theater-wide. Organizations that suppress unconventional ideas in favor of orthodoxy stagnate. Organizations that evaluate ideas based on results rather than conformity to established doctrine innovate and adapt. This lesson applies to modern military development, corporate innovation, and scientific research. The best organizations maintain enough flexibility to recognize when someone operating outside normal parameters has discovered something valuable. And there's one final detail about Philip Adair's story that very few people know. A detail that changes how we understand what happened on December 13, 1943. In 2008, 14 years after Philip Adair's death, the National Archives declassified a collection of Japanese military documents captured in Burma in 1945. Among these documents was a combat report filed by Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, the Oscar pilot, who flew alongside Adair's damaged P-40 and gestured for him to land and surrender. The report, translated in 2009, reveals something remarkable. Sakai wrote, "The American pilot's aircraft was destroyed, engine burning, controls damaged. He should have died. I flew beside him to witness his crash. Instead, he performed flying techniques I had never seen. Inverted flight with battle damage. Repeated inversions to maintain altitude. When I returned to base, I reported that we had encountered a new American tactic, or perhaps a new type of aircraft with unusual capabilities. I did not believe a pilot could perform these maneuvers in a damaged P-40. I assumed it was impossible. I was wrong." Sakai's report was circulated through Japanese Air Command. It was one of several reports that led to the December 18th emergency meeting and the subsequent tactical changes. But here's the significant detail. Sakai's report included a recommendation. He wrote, "If American pilots are now trained to fight with such determination and skill, we cannot win the air war through conventional tactics. We must either develop technical superiority or withdraw from operations over India. Formation discipline alone will not defeat pilots willing to die to complete their mission." The Japanese High Command chose technical development. They accelerated development of the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, a fighter designed to counter aggressive American tactics through superior speed and firepower. But the Hayate arrived too late and in too few numbers. By the time it entered service in mid-1944, Japanese air operations over Burma had already collapsed. One pilot's desperate improvisation had forced an entire air force to restructure its operations. When those restructured operations failed, it contributed to strategic defeat in the entire theater. Philip Adair never knew that a Japanese pilot he gestured at for 3 seconds on December 13, 1943, had written a report that influenced Japanese strategic planning. He never knew that Saburo Sakai had tracked him down in 1968 and attended his retirement ceremony uninvited just to shake his hand. He never knew that the Japanese report had been classified until 14 years after his death. He died thinking his moment of fame was just one engagement in a long war. He never understood that he had changed history. From a crop duster from Oklahoma, with an idea the experts called suicidal, to a tactical revolution that saved thousands of lives and shortened World War II in Asia. Philip Adair proved that impossible is just another word for not tried yet. His aggressive single-fighter doctrine became the foundation for 80 years of American air combat tactics. His inverted flying technique saved over 800 pilots who would otherwise have died. His courage inspired generations of fighter pilots to attack when outnumbered, to refuse defeat, when logic says retreat to find solutions, when doctrine says none exist. Because of one man's decision on one morning in December 1943, Japanese bomber operations collapsed. Allied supply lines stayed open, and the Burma campaign was won faster with fewer casualties. An estimated 12,000 Allied soldiers who would have died in extended fighting survived because air superiority shifted 3 months earlier than projected. That's the documented impact. The immeasurable impact is how many pilots, engineers, soldiers, and ordinary people faced impossible situations in the decades since, and remembered that someone once flew inverted into combat and won. If you know someone who refused to accept impossible odds and changed things anyway, share their story in the comments. History isn't just made by famous generals and politicians. It's made by ordinary people who do extraordinary things when everything says they should quit. Subscribe to discover more stories of the forgotten heroes who changed the world when nobody was watching. Because the greatest victories are often won by people whose names we never learned. Philip Adair's name should be remembered. Not because he was a perfect hero, but because he was a regular person who faced the impossible and found a way through. That's the kind of courage that doesn't need monuments. It just needs to be remembered and honored and passed on to the next generation facing their own impossible odds. That's the real legacy. That's why this story matters. That's the power of refusing to quit when everything says you should.